Neurodivergent means a person whose brain works slightly differently. The opposite is neurotypical, and this encompasses neurodiversity encompasses a lot of different neurological conditions. So things like autism, ADHD, OCD, dyspraxia, dyscalculia, and it's essentially the fact that the brain is wired in a slightly different way to the majority of people out there. You can push yourself and you can have wonderful experiences, even if you have something like autism or ADHD or dyspraxia or anything else. There will be additional considerations that you'll need to take when abroad, but it doesn't mean that you should have to miss out on experiences.
That is Dan Bird. He is today's guest and author of the book Go Neuro Way, where he shares how he's learned to embrace his autism while navigating the globe. And Dan really exemplifies one of the core values of this show, traveling the world on your terms, doing it in your way that works for you. And whether you are someone who is listening to this, who is perhaps somewhere on the spectrum, or you just want to learn more about what the travel experience is like for someone who is, this is a wonderful opportunity to dive in to get a better understanding of some of your fellow travelers out there and perhaps even rethink what is possible when you see superpowers instead of limitations. Let's get into it. Buckle up, strap in. Thanks for being here, and welcome to the Zero to Travel podcast, my friend.
You're listening to the Zero to Travel podcast, where we explore exciting travel-based work, lifestyle, and business opportunities, helping you to achieve your wildest travel dreams. And now your host, world wanderer and travel junkie, Jason Moore.
Hey, it's Jason here with ZeroToTravel.com. Welcome to the show. Thanks for being here, letting me bring a little travel into your ears today. This is the show to help you travel the world on your terms, to fill your life with as much travel as you desire, no matter what your situation or experience. And when I heard from Dan Bird, our guest today, by the way, you can check him out over at GoNeuroWay.com. We'll link up to it in the show notes. He said in his email, quote, "I'm keen to get the word out there about my book, as this is an underrepresented area of travel. And it'd be amazing to be able to speak with you about my experience." And, I agree. This is an underrepresented area. That was the main reason I wanted to have Dan on, to share his experience traveling with autism. And stick around on the back end. I'm going to share my number one takeaway from this chat, which might help you reshape your own travels. Plus, a couple wonderful quotes to wrap it up. One last thing, over at ZeroToTravel.com/newsletter, you can get our free weekly newsletter. I write it, goes out every week. And of course, it is free to sign up. So please join the community over there and stay in touch. Without further ado, here's my conversation with Dan. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you on the other side, my friend. Cheers. Dan Bird, welcome to the Zero to Travel podcast, my friend. How you doing?
Thank you very much. Yeah, I'm doing really well, thanks. I've been a fan of this podcast for years, so it's fantastic to come on here and be able to speak to you, Jason.
Yeah, I appreciated you reaching out, and you were right. I mean, your initial email, you said you were talking about your new self-published book. Congratulations, by the way. Go Neuro Way. Am I, pronouncing that correctly?
Either Go Neuro or Go Neuro. Yes.
Go Neuro Way, which is why I think subconsciously or consciously I'm wearing this Fleetwood Mac shirt, because one of their songs is Go Your Own Way. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it's a great tune. So you wanted to discuss how your travels have been with autism. I think for people listening, whether you are autistic or on the spectrum, we're going to get into all this stuff, or you maybe know somebody it does, or you just might encounter people out in the world. I think the idea here is to get a little bit of education and a better understanding of what that experience is like for you. Yeah, just learn a little bit more. So I saw on your website that you are living remotely between farms with your partner. I mean, what's the deal there? Are you a farmer or what? Yeah, that was the first time I read remote farmer.
I feel like I might need to change this, because a couple of people have come to me and said, "I didn't realize you were a farmer." I was like, "No, I'm not. I just live somewhere with lots of farms." Yeah, I go to a few different places right now. So we're actually in Yorkshire in England, where there's an abundance of farms everywhere you look. I'm originally from Liverpool, but yeah, Yorkshire has lots and lots of farms. But rest assured, I am not a farmer. I would like to be at some point, but yeah, not right now.
But I mean, tell me about the lifestyle. You have two places, and are you mostly at a home base, or are you mostly traveling, or what are you doing?
During COVID, my partner and I decided to buy a house in Liverpool together. It was both of our first houses, and Liverpool's quite a built-up city, really busy, lots of people. And within a year, we realized this just isn't for us. It wasn't the lifestyle that was conducive to our lives and to my autism. So we started looking elsewhere, and we found a great place that's actually in between two farms. They don't belong to us, but the place itself is really tranquil, really spacious, and doesn't have too many people sort of ambling about outside. So it's really, really been great for us. We both work remotely from home, so it's the perfect setup for us, really. And whenever we go off to do some travels, some exciting trips abroad, it's always the perfect base for us to come back and just be able to fully re-baseline ourselves.
I should have asked you this in the beginning, but, we're keeping it real here on the podcast. In terms of our conversation here, is there anything I should be aware of in terms of like your sensitivities or anything like that?
So I think because we've got a really good setup here, in which we're able to manage our needs. Like a lot of the things that would have bothered me a lot more in the city, so noises and smells and things like that, we're able to manage our environment much better here. So I think we're okay.
Okay, cool. Well, I mean, tell me about getting diagnosed, and you can of course educate us on what that means. But I really, through your personal story, I'd rather we get a bit of an education through that, because, you can only speak to your experience, of course. And I'm just wondering, just some of the research, and I can also try to put myself in your shoes and think, okay, you're probably having a lot of struggles leading up to this, and then getting diagnosed, maybe a mixed bag of kind of relief and a bit of understanding of what happened before. And also like, wow, I have this thing I have to deal with, but actually now kind of what you're dealing with. So what was it like during that period of your life?
Sure. So I received my diagnosis when I was 27, and a lot had led up to the diagnosis. So when I was younger, I found it really hard to connect with other people, other children my age. The things that I was interested in didn't always tally up with what other people wanted to do, and I had difficulties socializing and communicating with others. And for so many years, and particularly during my teen years, I just thought it was down to anxiety and just not connecting with other people. So I had lots of different treatment and went through different things to combat the anxiety, but nothing ever really felt like it was dealing with the underlying problem that was there, or condition. So none of the anxiety treatments fully worked. And then I went to university where things were even more chaotic, and I was moving between different places, and I lived abroad at one point. And even though I really loved a lot of those experiences, it still felt like there was something in the background that was holding me back. And then I left university, did my first few jobs after graduating, moved between a few different cities, and I was still experiencing a lot of these problems. And by this point, I didn't feel like I was a particularly anxious person. I felt like I dealt with a lot of the anxieties that had plagued me during my teen years, but it still felt like there were day-to-day challenges that I just couldn't put my finger on. And eventually the idea that I might be autistic started to formulate in my mind. And the more I learned about autism, the more I thought, actually, this is like reading about my life. The more I found out about this condition. So the company that I was working with at the time offered diagnoses with a psychiatrist who specialized in autism. So I had my session with him. We sat down for 4 hours. We talked about all aspects of my life and childhood and reasons why I think I might be autistic. And by the end of it, he said, "Yep, you've definitely got autism. You're definitely on the spectrum, and you have the positive attributes for this condition." And in that moment, it was the biggest sense of relief I had for years, because I realized I don't have to fight against the anxiety. I don't have to change myself anymore. This is just a part of who I am, and I can now start working on how best to create the life that caters to my autism.
Yeah, I'm sure it was a relief in some ways, right? Like to understand, okay, all of these sort of challenges that you described growing up and not being able to put your finger on it, and now knowing, okay, like, yeah, I wasn't imagining this, right? Like these were real challenges, and this is part of this thing. When people say they're on the spectrum, and you hear that term, and sometimes you hear these terms a lot just in society, but then we don't actually dig into what they mean, or like, you might just think you know what it means because you've heard it so many times. And that's probably like the place that I'm in right now. Like, I think I know what it means, but then a spectrum in and of itself is a wide variety of things, right? And so what does that actually mean? Where do you fall on it? How does that work?
I think you're right. Like you say, a spectrum is very broad, and to some degree, everybody will have aspects of autism that they themselves can relate to. For me personally, when I got my diagnosis, the psychiatrist said, yeah, you're obviously on the high performing end of the spectrum. You've been able to achieve a lot of things in your life. I think when people will start requiring support with it is when the individual attributes start impacting their lives in different ways. So for me, for example, I've always been incredibly sensitive to sensory experiences. So I've always been very, very sensitive to noise and to smells, and they've produced a lot of problems for me in the different situations that I've been in my life. I notice subtle noises much more than the average person, and they can be quite problematic and quite difficult for me to hear on a daily basis. And then issues with communicating, relating to other people, taking things very literally. These are all things that have been part of my experience too. But there's so many different attributes of being autistic that it will be completely different depending on the autistic person that you're speaking to. For me personally, it was really helpful to get that understanding, to know that I did fall within this autistic group, because it just gave me a huge amount of knowledge about myself, and it made me able to put that last puzzle piece in place to fully understand, the person that I am and why I found certain things hard.
I know you're not a medical professional, so we're not going to put you on the spot here, but when you're referring to the spectrum and you think about extreme cases that might be, way more obvious, and maybe the diagnosis becomes earlier because of that, right? And then you think about somebody like in your situation where you're at the other end of the spectrum, like you mentioned, high functioning, able to hold jobs and do all of the normal things, but then there's this ongoing thing that you can't put your finger on. I mean, you never know who's listening, right? Or what the situation is. And everybody maybe has different symptoms depending on where they're at. But perhaps it would be helpful for you to share some of the common sort of struggles within that end of the spectrum that you can speak to, because that might be a bit harder for people to like put their finger on, and they might have the same challenges. And I'm not saying like anybody listening can't say, sometimes you can Google one thing and think you have cancer, 5 minutes later. So we're here talking about this. So I think it's useful to get your knowledge on this.
So for me, probably the biggest challenge related to being somebody who's classified as a high performing autistic person is the lack of support that's available. Because when I got my diagnosis, the psychiatrist at the time said, I'm really surprised that this wasn't picked up on for you during childhood. A lot of the things that you're describing to me are things that are common about the autistic experience, but I'd kind of sidled through teenage years and 20s without getting that support or diagnosis. And there is a lack of available resources and support for people who can function with their autism in society, because the priority obviously has to be on the people who have greater challenges and difficulties. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's easy for the people who have managed to mask and adjust to the world, because there can still be things that are very, very difficult for them. In terms of some of my everyday challenges, so like I say, noises and smells tend to be quite high up my list. So small, subtle sounds that wouldn't bother other people can be very difficult for me. So, for example, the ticking of a clock, I hate. If there's a ticking clock in the room, it has to be moved to another room before I can fully chill out. I can hear subtle TV sounds from rooms away when other people wouldn't be able to hear that. I can hear, there are a lot of smaller sounds which are completely amplified for me. Similarly, smells as well can be very difficult. So if I'm in a new room and there's a particular smell of detergent or bleach that's being used, that can really trigger me and cause a strong response. It's something that maybe I'm noticing, but not everybody else in the room would too. The textures and the feeling of certain clothing can be quite difficult as well, and you can really hone in on how that feels compared to like another person's response to that same stimuli. One or two other things. So I take people very much at face value, very literally. So if people don't deliver on the expectations that they've set out, I can find that stressful. I think, well, you've said this, but it doesn't tally up with your actions. So I'm an absolute stickler for timekeeping. And if a friend is even 5 to 10 minutes late, I'm like, whoa, what's going on here? I don't understand. We set this time that we said that we would meet up. And working in a corporate job as well can present challenges related to that too. So I respond well to specific, direct and transparent language because I'm a very literal person. So sometimes corporate jargon can become very confusing for me and I have to call that out to be like, what are you talking about? An example is when the phrase, let's bring this to life, comes up quite a lot in our organization. And I say to people, I don't know what you mean with that. Like the thing isn't dead in the first place. Why do we need to bring it to life?
What do they mean?
Yeah. I don't know. I think it's to give something more visibility or to make something more apparent, but it's so confusing to me.
I'm right with you on the corporate jargon. It's just annoying, right? Let's put a pin in it and we'll come back. We'll come back to that. No, I'm kidding. Well, when I think about travel, because we're relating this back to travel, of course, you have the book. I wanted to have you on the show because I know your intention around this is pure, right? Like you want to put this out there in a way to help others who might be struggling with this. But, there might be a subset of listeners here that maybe they're not on the spectrum, but maybe they just have a sensitivity to some of these things, right? And this is where I want to get into the tips. And you mentioned noise and smells. And I mean, of course you walk into some place if you have your eyesight and everything's visual. And of course you see all that, but I would say maybe perhaps even more impactful than what you see when you first arrive somewhere are the noises and the smells. Because that's the first thing that's like, bam, like new smells, all kinds of craziness. I mean, from the airport all the way into town, whatever's going on, it's just like all new, all pretty intense for just the average person. So what do you do? Because travel, in some ways, all of this stuff is heightened. You don't have the control of the environment that you have at home.
Certainly. And I think traveling provides a really good opportunity to be able to confront a lot of these triggers and see how they impact you in a different setting. Because, day to day when you're working from home and you've got all the everyday day-to-day stresses, anything on top of that can feel very overwhelming, which is why sometimes in the past, a single smell or a single noise has been quite triggering and jarring for me. But traveling is a different experience. You don't have a lot of the day-to-day pressures and stresses that you would normally have. So sometimes it can provide a sort of positive stimulation for you. But what I find is that I always need time to recharge and rebalance when something like that happens. And over the years, I've learned to adjust the way that I've traveled as well, because when I first started going to new places, it was very much bucket list. Okay, let's go to these big cities. Let's go to these places which have a lot of things going on and are very noisy and bustling. And after, over time, I realized maybe these aren't the most helpful places for me to go to as somebody with autism. There's still a lot of adventure and travel and great places out there that I can go to that will trigger me less. And I can still experience that same stimulation with different noises and smells, but I can also have enough time to recharge and be able to re-baseline so that I'm not feeling overstimulated.
Okay, so can you give us a couple real world examples of those places that you've been to semi-recently, let's say? Sure.
So my partner and I did a large 4-month sabbatical trip in 2022. And as part of that, we spent about a month and a half in Europe. And we spent a couple of days doing the Camino de Santiago in Spain. We just wanted a taster of what it was like. And it was absolutely phenomenal. We were out in the countryside. It was really peaceful. There were people that you could speak to along the route, which was really nice. But it didn't ever feel overstimulating, and it didn't feel like it was too busy at all. And that was a really great opportunity for us to be able to be adventurous, to try somewhere new, but not somewhere that would overly trigger me.
There are so many different styles of travel. And like you said, we tend to think of, going to the big cities and seeing the big sights, but something like getting a little taste of maybe it's not on your bucket list, or you just don't desire to do like a crazy long walk. Getting a taste of it is an experience in and of itself. Some of these things might also be relevant for the introverted person, or maybe even the extrovert who's just wanting to go on a trip but be a little more what's the word I'm looking for? Like not cocooned, but just kind of maybe there's a bit more, they want a bit more internal space, let's say. Why a memoir about this? I'm guessing because you want to help others, but also, you could have done a practical guide. You didn't have to write about all of your own travel experiences. How was it to write about your experiences and put yourself out there in that way?
I've been lucky enough to be able to enjoy different types of traveling and overseas trips over my life. And I wanted to include a taster of each of those in the book and highlight the experiences that I found easier compared to the experiences which I found much harder. So I start off the book by talking about my early childhood experiences, just going on family organized trips away, package holidays, things like that. Then I move into the teen years where it's school trips and then my own organized travel for the first time. Then I went to university where I studied foreign languages. So I spent a bit of time out in Japan and Spain, living and studying abroad. Following that, it was business travel. Then it was a bit more solo travel, and then eventually traveling with a partner. And I wanted to touch upon different aspects and different ways to travel and the easy things that I found about each one of those experiences, but also the massive challenges. And then I think by the end of the book, it builds up a picture of what things have been helpful for me. What are the repeated experiences that I've had that make for a really positive traveling experience, but also something that won't trigger me or won't massively, upset me when I'm abroad.
Yeah. If there's like one big takeaway somebody can carry away from the book, what would that be?
I would say the biggest takeaway is traveling on your own terms, because as an autistic person, there will be additional considerations that you need to take when traveling abroad. And every person's traveling experience is completely unique to them and can be completely special to them. And I think that we can use our autistic strengths to make traveling trips more wholesome for us as well. So one of the really positive attributes of autism for me is that I get hyper focused on something that I'm really, really passionate about. Traveling is one of those things, but I have other things too in my life. One example is reality TV. I've always loved reality TV. The trashier, the better. And especially adventure reality TV as well. So things like Survivor, The Amazing Race. And I've been able to incorporate tips and things from those hobbies into my traveling too over the years. And it's almost become a bit of a blueprint for me. Okay, I've got this trip coming up. How can I make it more special to me and more linked to my version of autism? So I visited places that I've seen on Survivor or The Amazing Race, and that's made the trip, 10 times more special because it's connecting to two of my really important hobbies that I've spent a lot of time, pouring myself into over the years. So that's the biggest takeaway for me. Travel however you want. Use your autistic strengths to make the trip as personalized to you as possible.
You mentioned the positive attributes. I think when people hear something like this or being diagnosed with something, of course you tend to focus on sort of like the limitations, and you seem pretty open about, hey, let's you got a good attitude, like, hey, let's, how can I sort of spin this and still, live the life that I want on my terms? And you've been able to do that, and you're doing it, and you've been doing it for many years, which is awesome. Doing that is that can be a challenge for anybody. I just want to give you props here for that. Yeah. In terms of the positive attributes and things like that, you want to speak a little bit to that?
So I think I was quite lucky to get my diagnosis in my 20s, because I did have some friends who were diagnosed as autistic in their before they were 10, for example, and they received a lot of input from other people who told them what their autism was going to be like. So they were told to avoid certain things. They were told that they would always find certain things difficult. And I never had that luxury. I was forced into situations that were very uncomfortable for me, but I was able to find mechanisms to be able to get through those situations. So I was very lucky to get my diagnosis when I did, because I don't think I would have pushed myself as hard if I'd realized earlier that I was autistic. So it's allowed me to think about the strengths of autism much more, I believe. And I think that having intense hobbies and intense interests is definitely a strength for us. And it's something that I try and leverage in my day-to-day life to make myself happier. I think authenticity as well is a key strength, because we're not always going to say things in the same way that other people will. I'm not going to fall in line and say, let's bring this to life when it doesn't make any sense to me at all. I'll say, that doesn't make sense. Can we please just talk a bit more transparently? I'm extremely reliable as well, because when I say something, I mean it. You can take me at face value. So I will always be on time for a friend's meetup. And as well, I think that one of the negatives of autism has always been seen as being a bit too rigid and a bit too routines focused. And I think this has come from things like Rain Man and other portrayals of autistic people in the media, where, we're seen as robotic almost, and we just follow patterns and not able to socialize with people. I think that's also a massive positive, though, if you identify with that characteristic, because once you've learned the formula for something, you can apply that successfully in different contexts. So for me, for example, I never really get daunted by job interviews, because I feel like I've learned the typical formula of what they are like, and I kind of throw myself into them. And because I've learned that roadmap, it makes them a lot less stress inducing than it would do for the average person. So that's another benefit for me, I would say.
I love that you speak to the benefits, and I think that's a powerful message for the community you're building and the people you're trying to help. That's awesome. I think it's interesting to hear that being diagnosed at a younger age, or maybe in your case being misdiagnosed or not diagnosed, is a blessing in disguise, or for people diagnosed at a younger age. The idea, it sounds to me like you're saying, is like if people are told their limitations at a young age, then that can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. And there's a fine line there, because of course these are real challenges that people are dealing with. It's the responsibility of the people around them to serve that up in a way that maybe doesn't limit them, that's tricky. What do you think should be done in that space? Like if you're talking about systemic issues or systemic change, let's say, with the way kind of people are getting diagnosed and being given information that you know of, what would you change?
I think each course of action really depends on the individual and the specific things that they need. Because for me personally, even though I found a lot of aspects of travel, for example, difficult, I wouldn't have changed any of my trips at all. And I'm really happy that I went through those challenges and I was able to confront them and experience, what it was like. Because, traveling is a massive learning opportunity for everybody, and it really does push you out of your comfort zone. So I'm really happy that I went through those experiences. And now the situation is that, I've had those experiences. How do I make my traveling trips easier for myself? It's not about removing all the things that I might potentially find difficult. It's about adjusting the trip slightly just to make them a bit more tailored to me, whilst also still challenging myself. So I think, traveling is just one example, but I think overall it needs to be catered to the individual, because there are a lot of stereotypes out there around autism and what it means for each person. And not every characteristic will be the same or relevant for each person too. So it's about taking it on a case-by-case basis, I believe.
When you're out on the road, for any type of trip, business trips, you mentioned kind of how you handle it in a corporate environment where you kind of let people know what's going on. But along those lines, and this is for anybody listening who perhaps wants to communicate something to another individual that's uncomfortable, but they feel like it's important for them to know. So like in your case, I don't know if this has ever happened, but let's say you're on a trip and you're doing some group tour or something and you're multiple days with them, and you feel like if you share something about what triggers you and things like that you'll be able to mitigate some of that, or just give people education so they kind of know, hey, this isn't cool with me or whatever. I don't know if you have like personal examples of that, or if like you have these conversations where it's like, it's a little bit scary, maybe it's a little bit uncomfortable, but it's important for you to have them. And of course, there might be somebody listening that has their own version of that, whether it could be anything. Do you communicate this to other people? How do you do that? How do you kind of make that connection and do it in a way where, like it sort of, it's ever comfortable for everybody? Not that you have to make everybody comfortable, but you know what I'm saying?
Yeah. So I think before getting my diagnosis, I did try and communicate about the things that I needed when I was traveling. So particularly around noise, I would say to people, this is triggering me a little bit. Is there any way that we can reduce the noise? Not to an unreasonable degree, but just in situations that were supposed to be calm and tranquil, I used to try and communicate what I needed. But I found that without that explanation of why I was asking for this, a lot of times people weren't very receptive to it. So now I have the explanation of, okay, I find this difficult because I have autism. And I found those conversations much more productive now that I've got the explanation. It would have been nice to have people support you unconditionally, but it's from their perspective, they may have just seen me as a difficult person who wasn't being flexible himself. So now I do have the explanation. And with my current partner, for example, I told him about my autism quite early on in our relationship. And he has made an enormous effort whenever we've been traveling to help me with any triggers that I might experience when I'm abroad. So he's done a ton of research himself into particular places that I might find helpful or not so helpful. And we've been to some amazing places that I never would have even considered had I not done that research. So it's been really, really nice having somebody by my side who's got the understanding, who wants me to succeed in one of my greatest passions.
Yeah. Oh man, that's a beautiful thing to have in a relationship. Somebody that's got your back like that. That's awesome. How about your parents? How did they react to the whole diagnosis and the lifestyle you're living and everything?
I don't think anybody was particularly surprised when I told them about my diagnosis. They're like, okay, that makes sense. Okay, this makes sense. This is the reason why you are like this. This is the reason why you hate noise. So it made perfect sense to everybody that I told. But again, it made having those conversations about what I needed a lot more productive as well. Because again, previously, they'd say, why are you always telling us to be quiet? Why are you telling us to turn the music down? You're just being difficult. And, that would come up not just from them, but from everybody in my life. But now they're like, okay, we fully understand. We fully realize now why you need this particular thing. So it's given everybody a heightened level of understanding. And I think it has made our relationships better because now I'm not just seen as somebody who can be a bit petulant at times, I guess. I'm seen as somebody who's got specific needs and he's trying to communicate them the best that he can.
And good for you for doing that. I mean, it's like not always an easy thing to do. And I think this comes back to a word you said a little bit earlier, authenticity. And I think that can resonate with anybody listening right now. It's like, it could be anything. If you're authentic to who you are and what your needs are, and you're willing to put yourself out there and communicate them, you should, that's just being your authentic self. And like you said, you can't really control if somebody thinks that means you're being difficult or whatever, you can't control what other people think. Travel teaches you a lot about that too. Well, I mean, what have you learned from traveling? Just about yourself?
Probably the biggest learnings from travel have come about other people, to be honest, because I've found a hell of a lot of kindness and appreciation from others wherever I've gone in my life. And traveling has proven to me that I can make really wholesome connections with people cross borders, and I can do it in my way as well. So, for example, when I was a teenager, I was really self-conscious about not being able to do small talk the way that everybody else around me could or connect with people in the typical teenage way. And when I started going on some of my trips in my late teens and early 20s, I started experimenting with different types of socializing with people. So I was on the tall ships in 2008, which was a fleet of ships which raced from Liverpool up to Norway. And on the ships, you connected with your shipmates and did lots of activities with them. And a lot of times we wouldn't even talk to each other. We'd be in the same room, but we'd just start singing or we'd just start playing games. And I was like, wow, I feel a really strong connection to these people. I really, really like them. And we hadn't even used that many words, or we hadn't socialized in the typical way. And that was a pattern that followed over the years. Sometimes I could connect with people in a non-traditional way, and that was okay. And sometimes it makes the interaction that you have with that person a lot more memorable and a lot more wholesome. So it was playing on my autistic strengths of liking to interact with people, via games or via singing and not necessarily via small talk. And that was a really fantastic learning for me, that I could develop these great connections overseas in a slightly different way.
That sounds like an incredible adventure, by the way, taking a ship from Liverpool to Norway.
It was.
Did you learn how to sail?
I wouldn't say I'm a competent sailor as a result. I was probably one of the worst people on the boat, but it was fantastic. I mean, Liverpool was awarded Capital of Culture, European Capital of Culture in 2008. Yep. So
I remember that.
There were a lot of celebrations. Yeah, it was a big year. And one of the celebrations was that the tall ships race would start from Liverpool and travel up to Norway. So I applied for it. And, I talked earlier about how interviews is never really something which daunts me, and it's a strength of mine. And I went into the interview like no holds barred, just said, this is exactly why I want to be a part of this. This is the, love I've got of exploring and being out on the open water. And I was able to secure a place on the ship. And what followed was the best 2.5 weeks of my life, probably.
I'm a terrible job interviewer, by the way. I think that's why I work for myself. It's pretty funny. I like to interview people, but I don't like to be interviewed in like a job setting. I bomb almost every time. Good. So I'll have to get some interviewing tips from you if I ever ever go get myself a quote unquote real job any one of these days.
Don't do it. Too much corporate jargon.
Too much jargon. Let's bring this to life. Now, what are some of the other adventures I would say some of the most memorable adventures that you've had over the years?
I lived out in Japan for a year during university, and that was based on a bit of a whim, to be honest, because in my college, I was studying Spanish, and my intention was always to continue studying Spanish in university. But I thought, why don't we pair it with something a bit random for no other reason than that? And Japanese was the language that I thought was possibly most different to Spanish. So I was like, yeah, why not? Let's dedicate 4 years of my life to this. And it was very hard. But as part of it, I spent nearly a year living out in just north of Tokyo. And I think that's a really important part of the book. I talk about my Japan experience in quite a lot of detail because it was probably by that point the hardest thing that I'd ever done travel wise, and it was probably where I experienced most of my difficulties abroad, linked to my autism, but also linked to being abroad and the challenges that it presents as well. So I won't go into too much detail, but some of the experiences that I had out there involved being in a police station for 2.5 hours, a long distance breakup, and a stalker. So they were some of the fun, weird and wonderful things that I experienced when I was out there. But
wow,
Japan itself was phenomenal.
Well, I mean, we have to dig into one of those things, can't we?
Okay.
How did you end up in the police station?
Well, so it was actually linked to the stalker, because one day I was leaving my accommodation, the student flat that I was living in, and it was just going to one of my favorite restaurants. And all of a sudden I heard this booming, screaming voice behind me. So I turned, looked across my shoulder, and there was a person who I later found out lived in the same flats who was running towards me, screaming at me and pointing it in my face. And I didn't know what to do. I froze. And after a couple of seconds, I ran. I didn't know what else to do. I didn't want to confront the guy. I just ran as fast as I could in the opposite direction. And I ended up in a local 7-Eleven, like panting, out of breath. And the only Japanese that I could remember at that moment was, dangerous man, dangerous man. And I was frantically pointing outside the door just to try and get my point across that somebody was like following me. So the person who worked there got the hint, understood enough of what was happening. So they encouraged me to go to the police station. And when I went to the police station, that guy was already inside waiting for me. And I came in and he pointed at me and he said, this is the one I've been talking about. This is the man that I've been telling you about. He's been harassing me and my family for 4 years. And I was like, dude, I've been in Japan for 3 months. What are you talking about? It was insane. And then I was in there for several hours as we kind of went back and forth with the police officers. Eventually, one of the police officers recognized him from a previous case and calmed the situation down. And they took me back to my apartment. But that wasn't the end of the story. Later that day, the guy who'd also been released from the police station at that point, he started waiting outside my door. He'd found out exactly where I'd lived in the apartment building, and he was waiting outside my door, and he was crouched down behind the people so that I wouldn't see who it was. And he was lurking outside my door for ages, and it was a nightmare.
Did you move right away, or what did you do?
So I just panicked in that moment, and I emailed everybody that I was connected with, my university back at home in the UK, my university in Japan, my local flat coordinator person. And I just said, look, I'm feeling really unsafe at the moment. This is not a good situation. And luckily they were able to get somebody out within like half an hour. And the result of it was that I had to move accommodations, and I moved to a place about 30 minutes away, which was actually a lot nicer and didn't have a stalker follow me around. So worked out for the best.
Oh my gosh.
So it was crazy, but it taught me a lot about it. That was probably the lowest point of all of my travel experiences, and it was stressful. But I got through it as we all do with travel experiences.
Yeah. If you travel long enough, things are going to happen on the road, but you don't know what they're going to be. And that's pretty intense, man. You have your own baby reindeer, Japanese edition. I don't know if you've seen that
Exactly.
show, but it's terrible. Sorry that happened, but I guess you're okay.
It makes for a good bar story.
Well, tell me about the book. We talked about it being a memoir and everything, but it's a great effort to write a book. What's your biggest hope for it? Is this something you want to do more of? Are you building a career as an author? Was this just something you felt like you needed to kind of get all of this out to help anybody else that's having a similar thing? Yeah, just talk about it.
Yeah, so I went into it with no expectations, really. The whole process started about 2.5 years ago when my partner and I were in Cambodia. And I just started one day listing all the things that I found really easy about the travel and also really difficult. And then when I got home, I started thinking back about all the trips I've been on over the years. And I just noticed a lot of patterns and a lot of things that I maybe would have done differently had I fully sat down and thought about them and thought about how does this link to my autism. And it kind of snowballed from there. I started writing the book. I wanted to ensure that I included tips about what other people could do if they also had a love of traveling but were autistic, because I don't think the two should be, mutually exclusive. I want to be able to ultimately help other people in recognizing what situations might be difficult for them and what things they can do in advance to make the situation better. Because, no autistic person wants to have what we call an autistic meltdown through feeling overstimulated or stressed. And in the book, I've tried to lay out a lot of different techniques which might help them avoid getting to that point.
Have you had meltdowns like that on the road?
Yeah, 100%.
Are you willing to describe that experience, what it's like?
Sure, of course. So probably we've already talked about Japan, which was its own kettle of fish. But my first holiday with my partner, Matt, we went to Greece, and we just chose this place, Lefkada, based on a finger on a map technique. Neither one of us had ever heard of it, so we assumed it might be quite a quiet place, a nice place to unwind. And we didn't realize it was a favorite haunt of many a Brit abroad. Not a good recipe. And the place that we stayed, it had a pool in the middle of the resort, and all of the apartment rooms were facing onto the pool. And there was a bar next to the pool as well. And the bar would play booming music all the way through the day, even if nobody was at the pool or at the bar. And you could hear that music in the apartment rooms as well. So I spoke to the apartment manager and I said, look, is there any chance that you can turn the music down just ever so slightly so that we don't hear it in the rooms? But he said, no, not a chance. This is what we do all the time. And it's really difficult because I've got noise cancelling headphones on right now. And I tend to use them whenever I'm feeling like things are a bit too noisy. But whilst they're great, they don't block out everything, and reverberating beats still kind of pass through them at times. So I was never really getting any sanctuary from the noise. And we decided to go down to the beach to see if we could get a bit of respite down there. But every single bar that we went into was playing dance music, house music. Even some bars that were quiet when we walked past them then started immediately playing music when we went in, assuming that, that's what we wanted to hear. And I think I got really frustrated on the beach. I was feeling overstimulated, and I probably just started crying and shouted out a little bit, which to people who don't understand what's going on or don't understand that you have autism, it can look like just an adult having a tantrum, which is a horrible thing because it can be quite dehumanizing and infantilizing, I guess, to kind of have people see you that way. But no autistic person ever wants to have a meltdown. There's a series of events that lead up to that point, and you try your best to do things to get out of that situation, but sometimes it just doesn't work.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's tough. So thanks for sharing that, and good for people to be aware of. So do you have another book in you, do you think? Or
I'd love to write another book, yeah, because I'd love to travel more. I'd love to, experience more places and see more of the world. So fingers crossed. I've really enjoyed writing this one. I'd love to do another one in future.
What does neurodivergent mean?
So neurodivergent means a person whose brain works slightly differently. The opposite is neurotypical, and this encompasses neurodiversity encompasses a lot of different neurological conditions. So things like autism, ADHD, OCD, dyspraxia, dyscalculia, and it's essentially the fact that the brain is wired in a slightly different way to the majority of people out there.
I mentioned that because of your website, which you can share with people now if they want to check out your work.
Yeah, absolutely. So the website is the same as the book title. That's Go Neuro Way, goneuroway.com. The book is available to buy either through the website or through Amazon. They're the main channels where I'm selling the book right now.
Cool. Yeah. If there's any other any important points we missed or anything you want to share here, I just wanted to give you an opportunity to make sure that we got the full message that you wanted to share today.
Sure. So I think the biggest point, we've already talked about it, but it's just to reiterate that you can push yourself and you can have wonderful experiences, even if you have something like autism or ADHD or dyspraxia or anything else. There will be additional considerations that you'll need to take when abroad, but it doesn't mean that you should have to miss out on experiences. And I think for so long in the media and in TV shows and films, the depiction and portrayal of autistic and other neurodivergent people has been quite negative, and there's only ever been a focus on the challenges and the difficulties. But we're in a great time for neurodiverse people right now because we're sort of leveraging our voice for the first time in forever, really, and talking about the strengths and the great characteristics of our conditions and how we can make our lives more wholesome as a result of them. So yeah, don't be scared to push yourselves. There'll be challenges along the way, but it will be worth it.
I love that. And I love the idea of adapting your travels to, whatever it is you may be dealing with. And I think that also can open up different styles of travel that you may not have considered before, which is another exciting sort of added benefit, let's say. Man, I really appreciate you reaching out, listening to the show, and then offering to come on here and provide value to other listeners. And of course, taking the time to write the book to help other people that may be struggling with this, and encouraging them to get out and see the world. That's what we're all about here. So yeah, I appreciate you coming on and sharing your experience today. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no worries at all. Thanks for having me on. It's been great.
All right, man. Have a great day.
You too. Cheers.
There you have it. Thank you so much to Dan Bird for stopping by the show. Again, goneuroway.com is website. And I really enjoyed that conversation. I'm glad that we had a chance to talk about this topic, which is something we have not covered on this show in all these years. So thank you to Dan for giving me the opportunity to share his experience. Okay, my takeaway from this chat that might help reshape perhaps some of your travels, perhaps some of my travels. I really got inspired by this conversation on a couple levels. First, Dan's ability to just kind of hone in on the things that he sees as strengths. And it's not that he's not acknowledging some of the challenges. It's just that he's leaning into his strengths. And I think that's something that we can all do. And then how he is adapting, I should say, his travels to meet his sensory challenges. And, you don't have to be on the spectrum to know that making these types of adjustments for yourself can just be good general self-care on the road, right? If you know a party hostel isn't going to be a fun place to stay for you and you don't want to be around that, then you don't book into those hostels no matter how much money you're going to save or the location or anything. I'm just using that as a specific example. The point is there are some things we can control. And, part of the reason we travel is because we want to face the things that we can't control. We want to be out in the world, experiencing it fully. All of the, messiness and craziness and unpredictability and all the rest that comes with travel. But knowing what some of your personal challenges might be and trying to adapt to some of those can be, just a smart thing to do as a traveler. Doesn't mean you have to be traveling in a bubble. And perhaps this episode is an opportunity for all of us to just kind of think about that as we go into our next coming year of travel, and just think about, hey, where am I at right now? Like, what are the things I actually want out of this experience? Perhaps there's some decisions I can make that can support some of the challenges that I have on the road, or that I may have on the road. Just some food for thought here. Just throwing it out there to wrap this one up. And I'm also going to leave you with a couple quotes. These are from the author Carrie Magro, who said, quote, "Autism is not a tragedy. Ignorance is a tragedy." And the last one I'll leave you with, quote, "Autism can't define me. I define autism." I love that. And that's, again, going back to one of the core messages here of just empowerment. Thanks for listening. I'll see you next week. Peace and love to you and yours. Cheers.
This podcast has been brought to you by zerototravel.com. Ideas and advice to make your travel dreams a reality.